June 1959. Once I said to my mother, Aunt Katie had told me a strange story that her husband McElhenney had told her. It was soon after she got pregnant with Maeve. It was when McElhenney got a summer job as a conductor on the Lough Swilly buses that plied between Derry and Donegal on the Inishowen route. Derry, Burnfoot, Fawn, Buncrana, Malin, Carndonna, Glenealy, Maville, Derry, with lots of stops in between at houses, cottages, byways. Did she know that story? Did she remember it? I remember the moral of the story, she said, as he told it. Pity he didn't remember it himself. I told it to her again, probing for a reaction. She sat there very calmly, letting me do it. One of McElhenney's regular passengers was a man from Malin town, right at the tip of the Inishowen Peninsula. He was called Sean. He'd come on the bus always carrying a small brown attaché case, much bruised, in his huge hand. There was nothing in it but one baby sock. When he was asked how he knew that, he had said that Sean had opened the case once and shown him the sock, saying, "Take a look at that. The day I find its match, I stop all this travelling." Well, it seemed that Sean had lost his infant daughter years before. She had died in the fever hospital in Derry. Was brought in of an afternoon and was dead by tea time. Sean had collected all her belongings that evening, but one sock went missing. He was still trying to find it. He went to the hospital every day and sat in the waiting room, and the nurses would come in and tell him they were sorry, they'd looked but could not find it. They humoured him. There was no point in pretending they had found its match, because first, they had never seen the one in the suitcase, and second, Sean would have said no anyway to any sock, that it wasn't the match. And there are lots like him, McElhenney had said. If you saw what was in the luggage that's carried on that bus, you'd wonder what world you lived in. Country people are strange, he had said. They take everything personally, even accidents. If there's been a disaster, they always find some blame somewhere, in someone, often enough in themselves. Sean from Malin believed his child could not enter paradise until he, Sean, had collected everything belonging to it. It was a way of blaming himself for the child's death. McElhenney had said that the worst punishment of all was the one Sean of Malin had created for his child, not being able to let it die properly, getting it caught between this world and the next. The air of Donegal, of all Ireland, was full of such people, he had claimed, because of our bad history. Look at Lord Leitrim, over in the valley of Glenveigh, an evil bastard who cleared the valley of its people and got shot for it. Be sure he had no rest. He still rode that road every night as dusk was falling, up to the hedge where they shot him. The horse itself made no noise. It galloped along until it neared the spot in the hedge, and then for a second or two you could hear its hoofbeats drumming. As you heard these, the figure on the horse vanished for an instant. Then when you looked up the road, there it was again, gliding away into the darkness in absolute silence. Lord Leitrim and his kind would be like that until the day of judgment. Never alive, never dead, just shadows in the air. So what was the moral of the story? Oh, she answered, it was that people in small places make big mistakes. Not bigger than the mistakes of other people, but that there is less room for big mistakes in small places. She smiled ironically. As he knows now, she said. As we all do. August 1959. It was Crazy Joe who almost completed the story for me. He was regularly consigned for periods to Gransha, the local asylum. Yet when he came out again, he always seemed more disturbed, more upset. God's only excuse is that he does not exist, Joe announced to me, banging his stick on the railings outside the public library. He stared at me, but his eyes were so flickery and disturbed, I guessed he could see little clearly. Do you know what? I'd like nothing better than a walk around the lily pond if you'd let me lean on your arm. Then we'll be as right as rain. We went round slowly, his breathing still rancorous in his chest, but easing. You never say anything to me worth hearing, but you hear lots from me that's worth saying. I knew he had spent long periods in the local asylum, which had a cruel reputation. The only difference between the nurses and the inmates, they said, was the uniform. He was right. I had nothing to say to him. He always left me stranded, my head excited, my heart slow. You know no stories worth hearing. Sing instead. Do you know The Quiet Land of Erin? Then he sang a couple of the lines to himself. And 'tis I would let the Sunday go in the cuckoo glen above the bay. I watched a rose petal fall and skid on the grass for a bit before it rested uneasily. Sundays, said Joe, are terrible days. Everything terrible that I know happened on a Sunday. Isn't that strange? You'd know that yourself with your family history. Fire on a Saturday, execution on a Sunday. Or was the fire on a Friday? You'd not think I'd forget something like that now. Well, I remember that day. Never heard so many shots in me life. But the Sunday, that I'm sure of. No, it started on a Sunday, that's it. What started on a Sunday? He chanted in a light, parodic voice. 'Twas on a Sunday we asked him why. 'Twas on a Monday he had to die. I was silent for a moment. Were you there then, on the Sunday? Or the day of the shootout? Sure, who wasn't there, wherever there was that time? Everybody who mattered was there, all linked in, dancing to somebody else's tune, if only they knew it. I was a young man then. Not so mad then, I think, but on me way. On me way. So young Maeve's got married, I hear, and to a blackie as well. I'd have liked to see her father's face when he heard that. You could hardly see his face since he's in Chicago this long time, I replied. Oh, I still see his face, never you fear. 4 in the morning, the 8th of December 1926, getting out of the police car like a shadow. 2 men in the back, and our dear old friend Burke at the wheel. McElhenney stops to pull up his collar and I step out, so I do, from the wall where I'd been standing out of the rain, and I look close and I see who it is, and off I go like a shadow up the street and leave him standing there in the rain. So what was he doing there? What the hell do you think he was doing? Informing. Informing. Selling his people for a few shillings. I'll tell you this, he never saw me, but he got out in time. Never saw his wife or child again after that. But who tipped him off that he had been seen? Can't work that one out for sure, though I have me notions. He moved off along the path, humming to himself. So that was the tip-off. Joe. Joe identified McElhenney as the informer. It seemed unlikely, but there it was. October 1959. Was I at school the day Burke came in to talk to her? It happened when I was still at school, but it was 4 years later when I was at university before she told me. And then I think it was only because I was going away to France for the summer vacation, and she had this notion I might never come back or get killed in an accident. There has to be an end to it, Burke had said. A complete end, a real finish. A separation from all that grief, a walking away from it, a settling. Look at your father, he told her, dying with 2 deaths on his conscience and both of them the wrong man. Look at Katie and her shattered marriage and her child left without a father and the father living a double life out there in exile. Look at Frank, your husband, living in silence, believing his family disgraced by an informer and unwilling to talk about what he had had to suffer all those years, with his children around him asking questions and other people wondering about him, wondering why he had been let go that night the young fella found the gun. He had fixed that himself, Burke claimed, for he didn't want to see Frank take any more, and he knew he was not involved in anything. Is that why you bait my wains in front of him? She asked him in outrage. Is that why you left him black and blue to the waist? Sure, he had to do that in front of the others, he said. The special branch from Belfast, else it would have looked strange, and if they had taken over, Frank would have been a long time in jail. It took some effort on his part to persuade them Frank was harmless, but he was telling her now that he was sorry about it, and sorry about that other incident when he got the young lad in trouble over the stone throwing. But sure, didn't the young fella come back at him through the bishop? Clever wee lad, that. But the poison was spreading to him and his sisters and brothers as well. Isn't it about time it was all stopped? Did nobody want free of it? Why had it to go on and on? Well, she told me she let him know in quick order why. Injustice. The police themselves. Dirty politics. As Granty say, let it stop to people who have been the victims of it. What were they supposed to do? Say they're sorry they ever protested and go back to being unemployed, gerrymandered, beaten up by every policeman who took the notion, jailed by magistrates and judges who were so vicious that it was they who should be jailed, and for life, for all the harm they did and all the lives they ruined. He had no answer to that, just sat there with his head down, sighing every so often. And then he asked her if Frank knew, and was she going to tell him? And she told him that was between her and her husband, and if anyone else intervened there'd be more trouble on that account than there ever was before. What trouble? I asked her. What would she do? Christ in heaven knew what she could do, for what power had she? But she let them think she could do something or would do something. She was bluffing, like we learned to do at poker, I realised, and admired her, but wondered how she could keep it up. Everybody was caged in. I imagined talking to her, rehearsing conversations I would never have. Can't you see what you're doing, even now? Telling me all that Burke said and still not telling me anything I didn't find out for myself. Not telling me about you and my father, you and McElhenney, but letting me know about everything else. She was looking at me. I smiled at her. November 1959. Joe took to visiting my mother regularly after his release from the asylum. He was there quite often in the afternoons when I came in from school, sitting there on the sofa, talking into the air while my mother leaned back in the armchair, seemingly attentive to the multi-voiced drama. His abiding memory of his time in the asylum was of beatings from male nurses, of being plunged in baths of freezing water if he irritated them in any way. Wasn't that so? When he tipped the wink, he told my mother, tipped the wink to you-know-who about the other you-know-who. Look at the trouble that got him into. But look at the trouble it got him in and her out of. And wasn't he right? Wasn't he right? Wasn't that so, missus? He wasn't mad. Then he would weep, and my mother would rouse herself to tell him it was all right now. He was out of there. He wouldn't be going back. It was all over. I felt sorry for him too, but her sympathy for him angered me. Why couldn't she show the same interest in us? In my father? One day as my father came in and was washing his hands at the scullery sink, Joe stood up, swept his hat on and off in the usual way, and said in front of us all, "But for all that, missus, for all that, I never told them your story. Family secrets are family secrets. Sure, they might have come down here and told himself out there." The noise of the water running in the scullery stopped. My mother put a finger to her lips. "Now, Joe," she said. "On me oath, missus, the crown jewels are safe with me. No point in telling a secret, is there? What good's a secret if too many people know it?" My father came in, rubbing his arms and hands on a towel, an inquiring look on his face. Joe fled, almost bowing as he backed down the hall. "What was he talking about?" my father asked. My mother dismissed it. Joe, raving as ever. His head was scrambled worse every time he came out of the asylum. Perhaps it was the way she put her head down as she answered my father. Perhaps it was just the accumulation of all that Joe had said. But I suddenly knew. Oh, God. Now I knew. All of it. The final melancholy. Your last secret was with Joe. Mother. In crazy Joe's loose keeping, locked and unlocked in the asylum at Grantia. May 1960. It wasn't just that she was trapped by what had happened. She was trapped by my knowing it. It must be shame, I decided. She's paralysed by shame. She was ashamed of what she had done to my father. She was ashamed, I knew it. Every time she saw me, she felt exposed, even though I made it clear I would never say anything, and even tried to make it clear that I understood why she had behaved so. But I couldn't wholly understand, not without knowing more. I wanted to ask her if she had loved McElhenney at any time, really loved him. But I was afraid she might say she still loved him. Or even that she loved him for the years in between, when she first went out with him, through his leaving her and marrying Katie, through her fingering him with Joe's help as the informer, through her tipping him off and seeing him flee and vanish to Chicago, through Katie's grief, and finally through her meeting my father 4 years later and realising what Eddie had meant to him and his family. I didn't want to hear that she had loved him for all of that time, or for any part of it. even though I knew there must be some truth in it. What, finally, did she not know when she stood with my father at the altar rail to be married? That her father had ordered Eddie's execution? Was that all she didn't know? And what did he know? Just that his brother was an informer who had been shot? Yet there were all those years since their marriage in 1933. All those stories, hints, all that cover-up about Eddie having got away and disappeared. Did he not recognise that the story of Eddie and the story of McElhenney were so close? How could he have missed the connection? How could he not have seen that one was the imprint of the other? Or did he know and hold in his pain, his suspicions, for saying it out loud would destroy everything, make their marriage impossible? Sergeant Burke died, and his priest's sons concelebrated the Requiem Mass for him in the cathedral. The bishop attended the funeral. "How dare he do that?" hissed my mother. She wouldn't listen to us tell her that the police and the priests were always in cahoots with one another. No theories like that for her. It was personal. Everything was personal. I understood that. It had to be, when everything that was precious to her was so bound up with betrayal. I asked her once what she would like for her birthday. "Just for that day," she answered. "Just for that one day, the 17th of May, to forget everything. Or at least not to be reminded of it. Can you give me that?" I didn't reply. "Why don't you go away?" she asked me. "Then maybe I could look after your father properly for once, without your eyes on me." I told her I would. I'd go away to university. That would be her birthday gift, that promise. She nodded. I moved away just as she put out her hand towards me. June 1963. Staying loyal to my mother made me disloyal to my father. In case I should ever be tempted to tell him all I knew, I stayed at arm's length from him and saw him notice but could say nothing to explain. I went away to university in Belfast, glad to be free of the immediate pressures of living there, sorry to have so mishandled everything that I had created a distance between my parents and myself that had become my only way of loving him. So I celebrated all the anniversaries of all the deaths, all the betrayals, for both of them, in my head, year after year, until, to my pleasure and surprise, they began to become confused and muddled, and I wondered at times, had I dreamed it all? Hauntings are, in their way, very specific. Everything has to be exact, even the vagueness. My family's history was like that too. It came to me in bits from people who rarely recognised all they had told. Some of the things I remember, I don't really remember. I've just been told about them, so now I feel I remember them. Someone told me how my father, the night his parents were buried, was found lying down in the back shed of that house on the high street where they had lived, among the coal sacks and the chopped wood, crying unstoppably. I imagined it and believed it, but when I looked at him again I wondered, was that my father? My father. How he would have loved to have been educated. When I came down from Belfast the night I got my degree, I came into a kitchen crammed with people and chatter. I'd had a few drinks and was feeling light, so as I came through the door and as they looked up expectantly, I was about to put on an act of despair and pretend I'd failed, when I saw my father behind the door, getting off his chair, his face grey, his legs leaden. The rafters came swooping down again. The cloud above the Atlantic nudged the light into rays, and I was looking up at him as he straightened. At once I said, "I got it. A first." His huge hand held my shoulder for a second, and he smiled. "A first," he said, and sat down. "A first," he whispered to himself, his head down as everybody else began to talk again, and my mother nodded at him and said, We've been waiting since 6 for that news. What kept you? It's 1 in the morning. I had a drink or two in Belfast." "A drink or two," they all echoed, laughing. "I'd have a drink myself if I didn't have to work in the morning." He came from behind the door. "But I'll sleep well tonight." He went upstairs, He never took a drink in his life. I've reconstructed his vigil behind the door in that noisy room 100 times since. Just as I reconstructed his life out of the remains of the stories about his dead parents, his vanished older brother, his own unknowing and to me beloved silence. Oh, Father. The man behind the door, the boy weeping in the coal shed, the walk down that dusty road, the ruined rose bed, the confession in the church, his dead, betrayed brother. Was that all? And a whole lifetime? How bitterly did he feel, or was he saddened into quietness? How much did he know or not know? July 1972. Was nothing ever said in all those years afterwards, as we grew up, as their marriage mutated slowly around the secrets that she kept in a nucleus within herself? I would watch them together as they aged. She was less haunted, it seemed, than before. He was still anxious, with the air of someone whose anxiety was never focused. He knew something lay beyond him, but he had no real wish to reach for it. Maybe it was wise for him, for the whole marriage had been preserved by his not allowing the poison that had been released over all these years, as from a time-release capsule, ever getting to him in a lethal dose. I would have readily died rather than say anything to him, or insinuate anything before her about that last big mistake that so filled the small place they lived in. Of course Joe did not go to the IRA with his information about McElhenney. He would not have known where to go. He went to my mother. I knew this without any doubt. It was as if she had told me outright. It was she who brought Joe to my grandfather and had Joe tell what he saw that night of the 8th of December 1926, when he saw McElhenney get out of Burke's police car in the small hours of the morning. That's when grandfather realised for sure the mistake he had made with Eddie. But even then, my mother didn't know the full story of Eddie's death, just that he'd been executed in error, but not on her father's orders. That she couldn't have known, else she would not have been so upset that evening I was staying with her dying father, and she had come down so upset, saying Eddie's name. What she knew was bad enough. McElhenney, her sister's husband, the man she had once loved, maybe still loved, and who had ditched her, was an informer. Now she was informing on him. But rather than sentencing him to death, perhaps she was the one who then went and told him his cover was blown, that he had better get out. And then she had married my father, closing herself in forever, haunted forever. Her small figure at the turn of the stair. When I had left home, that was how I remembered her. Haunted. Haunted. How I had wanted to know what it was that plagued her, then to become the plague myself. There had been a time when once a year she placed a bet on the Intrigue Grand National Horse Race. Having a wee flutter, she called it. Every year she backed the horse that was drawn number 13. One year I placed the 2-shilling bet for her, and she won. I raced back to the bookmakers for her winnings and brought the money home to her. She took it and smiled and gave me a hug. "You have the luck for me," she had said. That was a long time ago. I felt it was almost a mercy when my mother suffered a stroke and lost the power of speech, just as the Troubles came in October 1968. I would look at her, sealed in her silence, and now she would smile slightly at me and very gently, almost imperceptibly, shake her head. I was to seal it all in too. Now we could love each other, at last, I imagined. Now we could have the luck for each other. We choked on CS gas fired by the army, saw or heard the explosions, the gunfire, the riots moving in close with their scrambled noises of glass breaking, petrol bombs flashing. She was not deterred at all by any of this from her patrolling of the stairs, the lobby, the fireside, where a tile surround had replaced the old range and made the threshold of the fire naked and banal. My father would sit with her at times, holding her hand, watching the television, both of them listening to the noise outside. Shouts, Occasional rifle fire, now and then the jump and boom of a bomb going off downtown. They were on their own in the house by this time. Everyone had moved out, gone away, got married. But we visited them often. I used to wonder what it did to them, watching and listening to the war outside. Twice the house was searched and badly damaged by British soldiers. Eamon was arrested and released. Jared was battened by the police during a riot. All through this, my father remained as silent as my mother. I imagined that in her silence, in the way she stroked his hand, smiled crookedly at him, let him brush her hair, bowing her head obediently for him, she had told him and won his understanding. I could believe now, as I never had when a child, that they were lovers. And suddenly, just before retirement, he had a heart attack. He lost his pension because he had flaked out a year too early. Now, as the war in the neighbourhood intensified, they both sat there in their weakness, entrapped in the noise from outside and in the propaganda noise of the television inside. Not long after, a second heart attack killed my father in his sleep. My mother sat beside the coffin, dry-eyed, her hand on his folded hands or on his brow. She would shiver slightly, as though at the cold of his body. He died the day a curfew was proclaimed by the army. The neighbourhood was closed between 9 in the evening and 9 the next morning, while the street barricades were torn down. That night I heard the army coming in before I saw it from the upstairs window. The bulldozers came first, lifting and lowering their streaming jaws in the lamplight as they shunted the barricades aside. Behind them came the armoured personnel carriers, reconnoitring and stopping, nosing around the barricades and angling their seeing lights down back lanes and side streets. I lay awake until dawn, when the noise of horse hooves roused me to the window again. As though in a dream, I watched a young gypsy boy jog sedately through the scurf of debris astride a grey mottled horse. Bareback, he held lightly to the horse's mane and turned out of sight in the direction the army had taken hours before, although it was still curfew. The clip-clop of the hooves echoed in the still streets after he had disappeared. I went down the stairs to make tea. In the hallway I heard a sigh and looked back to the lobby window. There was no shadow there. It must be my mother in her sleep, sighing, perhaps for my father. By 9 o'clock, curfew would be over. That evening we would take my father to the cathedral that hung in the stair window, and she would climb to her bedroom in silence, pausing at the turn of the stairs to stare out at the spire under which, for that night, before the darkened altar, he so innocently lay.